Как мировая экономика и развивающиеся рынки переживают пандемию и какие ключевые изменения ожидают эти мировые рынки после окончания пандемии? На виртуальной трибуне об этом расскажет всемирно известный экономист, профессор и директор Центра устойчивого развития Колумбийского университета Джеффри Сакс.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear students, I'm honored to open the final discussion of today. And we have with us one of the most famous and eminent economists in the world, an outstanding visionary and thinker, professor at Columbia University, Dr. Jeffrey Sachs. Dr. Sachs, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
This is a great honor and pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you. It's a great honor for me to be able to be part of this festival. And I want to thank also Kazakhstan for its thought leadership for many, many years, because Kazakhstan has gathered world leaders to think about a peaceful direction for the planet for countless years. And this has been so important. And this Nobel Fest is another example of the nation's leadership, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sachs. And my name is Maxat KURBENOV. I am the director of the Inclusive Development Foundation, and we are organizing the Nobel Fest. This is non-commercial and the biggest meeting in the region. We have 20,000 participants registered with us. Mainly, we have a lot of students, professors from universities across 8 countries of Central Asia and Caucasus. Thanks for being with us. And Professor Sachs, if I may, we will start the discussion. I know that you are quite busy and we have only 30 minutes. I know that you are quite familiar with Kazakhstan, as you have been here several times. And you know the region and the emerging markets as well. And I want to ask you the following question, as we are still living in the pandemic. The part of the world is fastly recovering. The major economies as US and China and US will, by the prospects, may have 5.6% of growth, and the China is also recovering very fastly. But the emerging markets may face a crisis, and mainly the developing countries. And I want to know your view on the prospects for emerging markets in 2021. You're thinking how they will, how the pandemic have challenged this region, our region, and the developing world. Thanks.
Of course, the pandemic disrupted the whole world economy, and we had a sharper contraction of the world economy than at any time since World War II. This has been a big, big disruption, and it's not over yet by any means. When we look at what's happened this year, every part of the world was disrupted. One part of the world, China and the neighbors in East Asia and the Pacific region. So I'm talking about countries including Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. Those countries, by and large, kept the pandemic reasonably under control. In some cases, spectacularly under control. China did a fantastic job of bringing the pandemic down to essentially zero after the first outbreak. Europe and the United States did a terrible job. Of course, we had Trump as president. He was our worst president in history. And we ended up with more than 500,000 deaths in the United States. Europe has also done a quite poor job up until now. So the world situation is mixed. Central Asia, as usual, is in the middle of things between East Asian success European failure to contain the epidemic, and a lot of virus spreading in Central Asia. So two things are needed to begin a real economic recovery. First, every country needs to take better public health measures to slow or stop the transmission of the disease. And China showed that this can be done, but most of us in other parts of the world didn't succeed. Second, we need to speed the production and access to the immunizations. This is important to save lives. It's important to stop transmission, and it's important to stop the development of new variations of the virus, which are very dangerous. And that's what's also making it hard to control right now. New variants that have spread from Britain, from South Africa, from other regions. We don't even know where they developed first, but those are the countries where they were first observed. So this is a race against time. We need a massive scaling up of public health and vaccine coverage. Russia's vaccine, the Gamaleya or the Sputnik vaccine, should be put into widespread use. China's vaccines, Sinovac and Sinopharm, should be put into widespread use. Of course, the vaccines developed in Europe and the United States should be scaled up and available everywhere. This is really an emergency. And I'm also working with the International Monetary Fund and with the US government and other governments to implement a new financial mechanism, the special drawing rights at the IMF, to provide every country with the financing that the country needs to ensure full-scale control of the pandemic. Until this is brought under control, real recovery is going to be extraordinarily difficult.
Thank you, Dr. Sachs. This is really important, as many developing countries have no access and the finance to for a huge vaccination, for overall vaccination of the population. And before we get back to vaccination, I would like to ask you the following big question we had previously before the pandemic, and it was maybe before the financial crisis. Many economists believe that over time developing countries would have a catch-up effect towards developed countries. Do you think the pandemic has changed this view, as according to the recent meeting of the G20, the major drivers would be US and China in the world? And before we used to say that emerging markets are the major drivers of the world. Do you think the pandemic have changed it, or it's a temporary effect?
Well, the emerging markets face specific challenges, and Kazakhstan faces a specific challenge in this regard also. That is the following. We are in the midst of two major technological transformations. One of them is the transformation to zero carbon energy. So we need to do this because of the global climate change. And that means that for major fossil fuel producers like Kazakhstan, it's really important to have a national strategy about how Kazakhstan is going to fit into a decarbonized world. The second major technology transformation is digital. And here, when one looks, for example, in Central Asia, the internet coverage is only about 1/4 of the population. So there's an imperative to get universal coverage of the population. I'd say that underpinning both of these also is the technological knowledge and capacity of the population. This is an era in which good education is essential to development. We are in a skill-based transformation. East Asia and China have done so well, in part because their school systems are excellent. They are scoring at the top of the world's rankings in science and mathematics and in reading. And that's a key part of their success. So I would say that developing countries can continue to close the gap with the leading countries, but it depends on shifting to a digital economy, shifting to a green economy, and shifting to a skill-based economy. All of that is a huge challenge and a huge social challenge. And since you're so valuably leading an institute on inclusive development, inclusion is vital, that every child should get a good education. Everybody should have access to digital services. So the inclusion aspect is extremely important.
Thank you, Dr. Sachs. You raised a very important issue on technologies and digital transformation we are facing today, and the pandemic have accelerated all the technologies and the digital sphere. And I want to ask you the following. As we see that pandemic have the major driver for this, for all the technologies, and even if we cannot see you in person, even if we cannot see our relatives in person, so we still have even more connections with the pandemic because we use all these technologies, including Microsoft Teams, Zoom, and many others. And I want to ask you, as you have mentioned, that the development of alternative energy and the zero carbon emission technologies are very important, and we see that in 2020 it was the major, all the companies in this sphere have grown so much, and but this was the issue mainly for developed countries. But what we see in emerging markets is that maybe do you think that pandemic will shift the emerging markets into more relevant issues like the economic development and inequality and sustainability and the climate change, and all issues with climate may go to this maybe not so important for them at this moment?
You know, I think the climate issue actually transcends COVID or even the short-term harsh economic crisis, because the climate changes are really getting dangerous. Today, I was just reading a few minutes ago about all of the dangers taking place in the Himalayan regions with landslides and collapse of infrastructure, flooding. You know, and I know those things, but I can't imagine them sometimes till you see before our eyes that even remote areas high in the mountains that I wouldn't put in the first place of danger are actually in huge danger. So the climate issue is getting worse because we have a tremendous amount of physical momentum in the warming of the planet. The planet's going to continue to warm for decades, no matter what we do, because it's still
Планета будет продолжать утепляться, несмотря от того.
It's still catching up with the emissions that we've already made. But if we don't stop the future emissions, we will create a terrible ongoing global crisis that won't be like COVID, where it's 2 or 3 or 4 years, but will be just an ongoing great difficulty. So I think that we're going to see the pressure to transform hitting everyone. And it's not easy for Kazakhstan, which is, of course, a hydrocarbon-based economy. It's not easy for Russia. It's not easy for the Gulf region, which depends heavily on the fossil fuels. But I think we're going to have electric vehicles, for example, everywhere. So we're not going to be using petrol the same way. The dangers from coal have virtually stopped all new coal-fired power plants being built around the world. The new US administration is announcing trillions of dollars of spending to create a green economy. Europe has announced its Green Deal. Japan, Korea, China all say zero by 2050 or 2060 at the latest in the case of China. So I don't think that this issue is going to diminish. And I would say that it is really important for researchers and policymakers to say, what should we be doing in this context?
Dear Dr. Sachs, in 2019, our team was doing a research, and the topic of the research was the sustainable development and the alternative energy in Kazakhstan, in the oil-rich country. And in 2019, most of experts were saying that we are still far in the development of alternative energy in Kazakhstan. But the pandemic have showed that the massive investments can come to green technologies, to the companies, to digital companies, to the companies which are doing the alternative energy, to electric cars. And I think if we do the research now for today, most of the people, most of the experts will say that this is important and we should develop it. So the issue has been changed in 1 year. This is quite amazing, and we hope that Kazakhstan will also develop the alternative energy and the green technologies, which is actually now the strategy for the country, how the country can shift from the oil economy into the more greener economy, we say. And Dr. Sachs, I want to ask you also on inequality. As we say, the one of the things that pandemic have raised is a huge inequality between not only countries, but also between people. We have the technological inequality between the countries. And do you think that this gap will be larger, or you think that as soon as pandemic will end, the gap will be much smaller?
I think what's interesting for us is the fact that we could really empower people everywhere to have good and decent lives, and do that more directly and even more easily than at any time in history. Because, of course, throughout human existence, we've had inequality. But for most of human history, the inequality depended on who owned more land, for example, who had more physical assets. But today, the inequality, and in the future, the inequality will depend tremendously on how good was your education. If you didn't receive a good education, there will be no chance to be out of poverty. Whereas if you have good skills, good knowledge, and an ability to work effectively, we don't know exactly what kind of job in the future because of all of the change, but the capacity to find a decent way forward will be so much easier. So I believe that the single most important step that we need for reducing inequality is to ensure, and think of it as a kind of a challenge for a nation, that every child born in the nation, girl and boy, has a safe childbirth, has a healthful environment in which to have early development, gets an early beginning in schooling in early childhood development, and then gets quality education and empowerment and skills, both the technical knowledge of learning science and mathematics and so on, and also the human knowledge about the kind of world that they will be growing up in. If we could do that everywhere in the world, this would be the most profound contribution to a more inclusive, fair, and peaceful world in the future. And the digital technologies make this much more possible because we can now reach kids, if we try, with the digital learning, online learning, in ways that we didn't even know a year ago or 2 years ago. But it won't happen by itself because a poor child in a remote village is not going to be online unless we say that's a national priority, that every child is getting a good education. And what they will receive online will not be good unless we make it a priority to develop a good curriculum, to use all of this mass knowledge for really educating young people. I think it's the single most important investment we can make, universal digital access and quality services of health and education. And it not only is empowering, but it also is equalizing. It is the most important step to an inclusive society. Now, government needs to take the leadership in this. I think what I'm trying to do is to ensure that if governments don't have the financing, we mobilize whatever international financing is needed, because there's a lot of wealth, there are a lot of rich people. There should not be anyone on the planet who, because of their own poverty, isn't able to access these life empowering services. So that's the way I think we have to think. Complete inclusion, focus on our young people, focus on the technology, because that is going to be the key for the haves of the world. And I would like everyone to be part of the haves and to have no more have-nots.
And Dr. Sachs, I want to also to mention to you that we will have from April 12th to 16th, we are going to have 15 Nobel Prize lectures for the students of Central Asia and Caucasus, and we are going to have around 50,000 of students joining us, and it will be all available in YouTube, and of course it's going to be free for all participants. It will be on different languages. So what we're trying to do is to make the inclusive technologies to work for students and for young population.
And you know what's going to happen in 20 or 30 years, one of those students, or maybe many, are going to say, the reason I got my Nobel Prize is that I got to listen to a free lecture in 2021 of a Nobel laureate who inspired me to go study something I was interested in. And that is the way this is really going to work. So this inclusive knowledge is really our fantastic opportunity. So let me congratulate you on that. I think it's a tremendous initiative. And it's the kind of initiative we should be exploring, pioneering to really bring knowledge to every child. And just let's also work with the big tech companies and the telecoms industry and the United Nations and others to say, look, we've got to get access for every child, at least a device where they can watch this, and free connectivity so that they can become a Nobel Prize winner in the future.
Thank you so much. Yes, actually, it's true. We hope that in 10 or 20 years, this will be, we will have the fruits from our tree. And we have a question from audience. Let's imagine if you would become an advisor for governments of the region of Central Asia and Caucasus, what structural reforms you would recommend to have a more inclusive economies in the region, as this is a major question now for all the emerging markets and for our region as well. And what would be your recommendations on the development of human capital?
So I would recommend two things. First, the strategy internally to ensure a green and digital economy of the future. And I would aim for Kazakhstan 2050, Uzbekistan 2050, Tajikistan 2050, and so forth. I would ask the question, what should our society look like in the year 2050, and how do we invest starting now to get to where we want to go, to look at the path of transformation, to ensure that the society is green, digital, prosperous, and inclusive. The second thing is diplomacy. I would send senior diplomats, either by Zoom or by airplane, to Beijing, to Brussels, and to Washington. And I would say to the major powers, do not have conflicts. We don't want to choose between Europe and China. We don't want to choose between the US and China. We can't. We're in Central Asia. We're in between. We don't want more sanctions on Russia. We don't want a divided world. We need to think constructively of how all of the major powers can work together to build the future, because while they don't get it sometimes in Washington, this is not a zero-sum world. There is no reason in the world for a struggle between China and the United States. It's absurd and it's dangerous. And we need to stop this picking sides and creating new Cold Wars, because I think Kazakhstan, but I would say every place knows the other Cold War was no favor to humanity at all. And so I think that this is a really important point. But for Central Asia, it's a very practical point, because I'm a big supporter of China's Belt and Road Initiative, for example. I view it as absolutely what is needed, building infrastructure. I emphasize to my friends in China, make it green, make it renewable, make it 21st century, make it fast rail, 5G, all the things that are really needed, not more coal, oil, and gas, make it what we need. But then I say to my friends in Europe, don't view the Belt and Road Initiative as some hostile force. You should join so that everybody can meet in Almaty and say, look, we now have bridged all of Eurasia with 5G, fast electric rail. We have digital technologies. We have a Eurasian-wide green energy system, climate safe. Now we're talking. Then the world would really work. And so this is, I think, a major point, which is I'm trying every day to stop the American mentality from viewing China as an enemy. We need to find a cooperative approach.
Yes, we also hope that the Belt and Road will continue to develop, and it will become more greener, more digital, and more inclusive to all countries. And we have also another question from the audience concerning the Sustainable Development Goals. As emerging markets facing the limited finance and the limited investments in now at this period, do you think that emerging markets will face a challenge to make sure that they are able to achieve the SDG goals?
Absolutely. There's a big challenge of finance. And I can give an example of this from my own country. The United States has spent $5 trillion in the last 12 months in fighting COVID. $2.1 trillion in March 2020, $900 billion in December 2020, and now 1.9 trillion in March 2021. President Biden has just announced another $2.3 trillion program for infrastructure, which I believe will pass the US Congress in the next couple of months. So that would raise the total amount to 7.3 trillion. And the Biden administration is going to introduce another package, probably of another couple $1 trillion within a couple of months for fighting poverty in the United States. So we might spend extra $8 or $9 trillion in the United States to combat COVID and to recover better. But there's no emerging market or developing country in the world that can come close to that kind of financing. And so we need to think, how can we mobilize much larger amounts of financing for the green and digital economies of Kazakhstan and of the emerging markets? And there, of course, private finance can play a role, but I also believe we should have a huge increase in the capital base of the big multilateral development banks like the Asian Development Bank, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, the China Development Bank, the European Investment Bank, EIB, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So I would like to go through the balance sheets of all of those multilateral development banks and increase their capital base significantly so that they can be a main agent for a tremendous expansion of investments in the emerging economies. I think this is feasible. Interest rates are still, fortunately, very low. We should tap the capital markets through the MDBs and then use the financing for the structural transformation and the inclusive investments. And this is what I'm going to be trying to develop in the next few months. And my suggestions to the United Nations and to my own government, the United States, and other governments, that we really expand the financing of the multilateral development banks.
Thank you for the great work which you are doing, and we are all living under one roof in one house, and the name of this house is our planet. And the climate issues and the sustainability is not only problem for one country, but it's a problem for the whole world. And thank you for all the work you are doing in UN and on the sustainability. We hope that more and more people will continue to understand it, and more technological companies and the greener companies will appear and come to emerging markets and start a new production here. Thank you for joining us. It was a great pleasure to have you with us at the Nobel Fest. We hope to see you next time in person.
Yes.
As soon as the situation will become better, we hope to meet you in person. Thank you so much. It was a great honor to have you.
Congratulations to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye. Bye.